Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you very much. My question is to the Prime Minister. This morning the Prime Minister spoke glowingly of his predecessor Malcolm Turnbull, saying, and I quote, "I have no doubt Malcolm will represent Australian government policy and the Australian nation extremely well." As the Prime Minister clearly thinks so highly of his predecessor, would he please finally tell the Australian people why is Malcolm Turnbull no longer the Prime Minister of Australia?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question about the former Prime Minister's attendance at that summit in Bali, Mr Speaker. 8 weeks ago, when I met with President Widodo, and he indicated to me that the former Prime Minister had expressed his willingness to attend that summit. This is an important summit, both for Indonesia and more broadly about the future of our oceans. And I was unable to attend that summit because of my other commitments, Mr Speaker, and we discussed the issue, President Widodo and I, and we thought it would be a good opportunity if the former Prime Minister were able to attend that summit, given their very strong, close working relationship. So, Mr Speaker, I will always put the diplomatic and national interest of Australia ahead of any other considerations. What I will do is act in the national interest of Australia, and I look forward to the former Prime Minister being able to represent us on that occasion. The decision was taken weeks and weeks ago. I believe it was the right decision for Australia, and I will continue to work constructively with former Prime Ministers, whether they continue to be in this chamber. The member for Ringa is doing a terrific job out there, working hard on getting Indigenous children into schools. I was very pleased to welcome, Mr Speaker, very pleased to welcome the former Prime Minister Julia Gillard to this chamber this week, and I'm very pleased that she has been here today and recognised with the unveiling of her portrait here in the House. But I remember this is what was said in Paul Kelly's triumph and demise, Mr Speaker, about what two former Prime Ministers thought of the Leader of the Opposition. The distrust between Rudd and Shorten was intense and enduring. The Gillard camp was contemptuous of Shorten, considering him weak and duplicitous. Neither side trusted him and neither side revised its view. How insightful.
The member for Dunkley. Members on both sides. The member for Brand. The member for Griffith is Wall.
Thank you, Mr
The
Speaker.
member for Dunkley has the call.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister inform the House how the government is acting to ensure that Australians keep more of what they earn? Is the Prime Minister aware of any risks to this approach?
Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for Dunkley for his question, and I thank him for his strong belief, like all members on this side of the House, that our government believes in a fair go for those who have a go, and that means we believe that Australians should keep more of what they earn. We want them to be able to keep more of what they earn and pay out less, Mr Speaker, and that's why we announced this week and continue to build on the work that we've put in place as a government to get electricity prices down by firstly ensuring that we take the large energy companies to task so they do the right thing by their customers, and we get those large energy companies in line with the tougher powers and the other measures we're putting in place to achieve just that. But it's also about not adopting the reckless international targets that the Labor Party would pursue if they are in government, which would see a 45% emissions reduction target, which would see a bigger impost on the household bills, electricity bills of mums and dads and pensioners and small and family businesses of greater than the carbon tax they inflicted on the Australian people, the one they said they wouldn't introduce, then did introduce, but our government got rid of, Mr Speaker, when we came to government. And secondly, we're doing it through lower taxes. Lower taxes for wage earners, legislated $144 billion worth of income tax cuts for all Australian wage earners, abolishing an entire tier of the tax system. So as people go out there, as they work more year upon year upon year, they won't have it dragged back because of bracket creep, because our government has taken action on bracket creep. Now, those opposite want to cut those income tax cuts in half and rip $70 billion of tax back from the hard-earning wage earners of Australia. And we've done the same thing for small and family businesses, legislating to cut their taxes to 25%. And we're keeping spending under control, Mr Speaker, the lowest rate of expenditure growth of any government going back 50 years, Mr Speaker. And that means, not only does that mean we are able to keep expenditure under control, which is getting the budget back into surplus, retaining our AAA credit rating a year earlier on that return to balance as projected, but also, Mr Speaker, it means we are able to keep taxes under control. Now, those opposite can't keep taxes under control because they can't keep spending under control. That is why they're going to force Australians to pay more and keep less of what they earn. And they're going to do that by whacking their tax, by abolishing negative gearing as we know it, and putting up the capital gains tax, which will rob construction workers and tradies of their jobs, Mr Speaker, and undermine the value of the one thing Australians work so hard for, and that is the value of their own home.
The member for BOWMAN.
Thank you. Question to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer update the House on how the government is reducing taxes right across the economy? What are the risks for hard-working families of higher taxing alternatives?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for BOWMAN for his question. And I know that he's working hard for the more than 14,000 small and medium-sized businesses across his electorate, the more than 25,000 retirees and the thousands of families, Mr Speaker. And they know that the Australian economy is strong and it's growing. Growth is up, unemployment is down, and over the last financial year, more than 100,000 young people have got a job. The highest number on record, Mr Speaker. Now, all this is put at risk from a Labor Party that will tax you from the cradle to the grave, Mr Speaker. A Labor Party that will tax you from the cradle to the grave. In fact, they've got a new agency. Births, deaths and taxes, Mr Speaker. That's their new agency. Now, Mr Speaker, they have a $200 billion down payment, increased taxes on your income, increased taxes on your business, increases taxes on your electricity, increased taxes on your savings, and a despicable increase in tax on your property, Mr Speaker, with their changes to negative gearing and capital gains, Mr Speaker. Now, we've seen today from the Master Builders Association what the impact will be of Labor's policy. 32,000 jobs.
Members on my left.
Plumbers, carpenters, an $11.8 billion hit to the Australian economy, Mr Speaker. 42,000 fewer dwellings will be built because of Labor's policy, Mr Speaker. So as a result of Labor's new property tax, not only will rents go up, Mr Speaker, not only will jobs go down, Mr Speaker, but the value of the household home, the value of the family home, the #1 asset, will be hit, Mr Speaker. Now, the Labor Party has flip-flopped on company tax. The Labor Party has flip-flopped on the retiree tax. And it's only a matter of time before the Labor Party lacks the courage of their convictions to take this disastrous property tax to the Australian people.
The member for McMahon has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer, and I refer to his answer just now. Given the modelling he just referred to does not model Labor's reforms to negative gearing and does not recognise—
Member for McMahon could just pause for a second. The Leader of the House needs to refer to my statements on both days of this week. Okay? It is very disturbing. I can't hear the question. Can the member for McMahon begin again?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer and refers to his answer just now. Given the modelling that he referred to does not model Labor's reforms to negative gearing and does not recognise that Labor's policy grandfathers existing investments, and given the government's own Treasury modelling shows a modest impact from Labor's policy of negative gearing reform, will the Treasurer now apologise for misleading the House and misleading the Australian people?
The Treasurer has the call.
I thought I just had a Dorothy Dixon, Mr Speaker. Beware those who protest too much. That's what I say, Mr Speaker, because this is what the Master Builders Association CEO said. We didn't need to consider the grandfathering because we're looking at future investment. So the hits in terms of increased housing means that future investment is less likely, and therefore we will see a downturn in the housing sector as a result of Labor's policy, Mr Speaker. Now, Mr Speaker, we know that Labor's policy will hit those who have invested in the property sector, the teachers, the police officers, the emergency services workers, the nurses, Mr Speaker. And we know that the Labor Party's policy is a new Labor Party policy, because what did the then Treasurer of the Labor Party in Australia, the member for Lilly, say when Labor was last in government? What did the member for Lilly, Euromoney's Man of the Year, what did he say about negative gearing? This is what the member for Lilly said when he was Treasurer. He said it would be economically disastrous to do anything on negative gearing, Mr Speaker. Economically disastrous. Now the member for Lilly is the incoming president of the Labor Party. Maybe he can change this disastrous Labor policy and increase property tax on hard-working Australian families.
Member for McEwen will cease interjecting. Just before I call the member for Indi, I'd also like to inform the House we have joining us in the gallery this afternoon former member, the Honourable Yvette Darth, Queensland Attorney-General. On behalf of the House, a warm welcome to you, and I call the member for Indi.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is the Minister for Education. Minister, last week I spoke at the Regional Universities Conference hosted by Southern Cross University. We discussed how regional higher education institutes support workforce development, create jobs and drive regional growth. Education, employment and infrastructure provide the anchors for regional population growth and need to be part of any population policy. Minister, can you give us an update on how regional education will be integral to population policy, and an update on the government's response to the recommendation of the regions of the Reddy report for a national regional higher education strategy?
The Minister for Education has the call.
I think they're very worried about this.
Thanks, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for her question. And she knows, as all members in this House who represent regional and rural electorates know, the importance of regional education to our regions, and not only the importance of education but also the importance of employment and also the importance of infrastructure. And anything that this government does to help drive population growth into the regions, she can be rest assured that education will be central to that, that infrastructure will be central to that, and also that employment will be central to that. Can I advise the member that currently there are 400,000 primary and secondary students living in regional, rural and remote Australia. This is compared to around 214,000 tertiary students who are living in the regions. And what we want to see is as many of those students who are at the primary and secondary level go on to either a first-class tertiary education or first-class vocational training. And that is what we are trying to do. And we know that that will help when it comes to population growth. The Regional Universities Network, the conference of which the member spoke at, have estimated that between 60% to 80% of their recent graduates are now currently employed in regional areas. So there is proof positive that if we can educate our children in the regions, they will stay there and they will be employed there. Now, I was also asked about progress on the regions at the Reddy report, and can I commend the member who chaired that, the member for Murray, who chaired that committee report, and it is an excellent report. It rightly points out local education and training that is engaged in its community is pivotal to regional development and decentralisation. Absolutely true. Now, I am looking very closely at the recommendations in that report which are relevant to education, and I will have more to say on those matters. And I know that the relevant minister is also looking at the broader report and will have more to say on that very shortly, because it is an important piece of work when it comes to advising the government on what we should be doing to grow in our regions in a very sustainable way, and in a way which encourages our young to not only look to the capital cities but to look to their own communities as places where they can be educated, where they can go on to build families, where they could go on to be successfully employed. And that is what we want to see as a government. And I thank the member for her question.
The member for Cowper.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development. Minister, how is the government supporting regional communities through tax relief and investment in infrastructure? Are there any risks to this approach?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for Cowper for his good question, Mr Speaker. A strong economy means that we can have more jobs. A strong economy built upon by the strong economic policies of the Liberals and the Nationals in government means that regional communities such as Coffs Harbour, such as Port Macquarie can prosper now and into the future. And that's what we are delivering. Strong prosperity, strong growth, and certainly in regional economies. And what it all boils down to is jobs. Jobs for today, jobs for tomorrow. We know that when you have a strong economy, businesses have the confidence to back themselves. Small businesses in particular back themselves, such as Eagle Copters in Coffs Harbour. They are a wonderful decentralisation story. They moved to Coffs, they've expanded their operations, they've employed more people. They're the sorts of business. They're the sorts of business that puts on apprentices, puts on that older Australian for perhaps a career-changing move. That's what we want to back. We also want to back infrastructure, because infrastructure also backs employment, backs jobs, such as Barton's Bridge. Now, for those opposite, and I can hear them yell out, Barton's Bridge is replaced a timber bridge. Now, you might laugh, member for Watson, but what it's doing, it's connecting little Crosmaglen Public School. It's giving them the connectivity they need. Now, Crosmaglen, the Minister for Education might like to know, has a student population of just 11. They need the connectivity just like any other community. And I was there with those 11 students and their wonderful principal the other day on that new concrete structure, and they were delighted. Delighted in the member for Cowper's advocacy, delighted that he delivered that vital infrastructure piece. And that's what we're doing. It's part of an overall $75 billion pipeline of investment. And it's connecting regional communities, it's making sure that there's less congestion in capital cities, but it's making sure that little communities like that get the bridges that they deserve and that they need, and that they know that is going to make sure that their connectivity is there for today and for the future. And what I see opposite is Setca's senators yelling out, carrying on, as usual, Setca's senators. That's what they are. We saw a little bit of a glimpse of it in Melbourne yesterday. That's what we saw. What will happen if the member for Maribyrnong ever becomes Prime Minister? Let's hope that day does not occur. But what we've seen yesterday is just a little glimpse into the future, if ever that should happen. But what we want to do is back people like Stan Smith from South West Rocks, an 83-year-old retiree who doesn't want his savings stripped away, a self-funded retiree who's going to lose a lot if ever Labor becomes the government. We don't want that to happen. We want to back people like Stan Smith. We want to back people who are working hard, creating job opportunities for other Australians.
Has concluded. The member for Grayndler.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is addressed to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Infrastructure. And I refer to reports in the Herald Sun on the 2nd of September that in the budget funding for 10 infrastructure projects,
members on my right,
including the Rockhampton Ring Road, Mackay Ring Road Stage 2, Lingfield Road Overpass and Western Sydney Rail, were all secretly approved but not announced. Why, at a time when the road toll is rising and congestion in our cities is worsening, is the government sitting on these projects and not delivering them?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
we are delivering the infrastructure that Australians want, expect, need and deserve. We are rolling those infrastructure projects out, and I would have thought that the Shadow Minister for Infrastructure, having sat with me in a very bipartisan way about road safety, would not have brought road safety into that question. I know the Shadow Minister for Infrastructure has road safety on his mind, just as I do. And I've heard the Shadow Minister for Infrastructure talk about the Kempsey bus crash. I know that the $971 million Coffs Harbour bypass. I know that he's talked about it. We've actually delivered it. We're getting on with the job of actually building it. That's what we do. Those opposite, they talk. We deliver. We build. And we build for road safety, we build for better connectivity. We're getting on with the job. We've got a $75 billion, a record amount of infrastructure that we are rolling out. We're rolling it out now. We're rolling it out into the future. It's a decade-long pipeline of investment. That's what we're doing. That's what we'll continue to do.
Has the Deputy Prime Minister concluded his answer? The member for Grayndler on a point of order.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And it goes to relevance. It was a specific question about the 10 projects that they've funded that they won't do anything about actually announcing, let alone building.
Member for Grayndler will resume his seat. Your microphone's off. Member for Grayndler resume his seat. The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
We are getting on with, I repeat, we are getting on with the job of building these projects and others. We will continue to do it. We'll continue to employ Australians and we'll continue to make sure that local procurement is something that is important for all of those projects that we are rolling out. They are creating jobs. They're creating opportunities. And the member talks about about Rockhampton in Capricornia, and certainly we've got on and we're investing in the $176 million Rookwood Weir. Those opposite, they could only dream about water infrastructure. The member for Watson, when he had carriage of that portfolio, wanted to take the water away from the irrigators. We're building infrastructure to make sure that we store more water because it's Australia's most valuable resource. That's what we're doing. We're building, not only we are building infrastructure, not only are we building the rail, $9.3 billion in the inland rail, that 1,700-kilometre corridor of commerce between Melbourne and Brisbane. Not only are we developing our ports, not only are we developing remote airstrips and getting on with the job of building better roads, but we're also building confidence. We're building strength in our economy. And you know what? We'll keep doing it. Now, next year, year after that and the year after that. Australians know it. They have every confidence in us to deliver that pipeline of investment. You'll talk about it. We'll just get on and we'll do it.
Yeah. The member for Bennelong.
Speaker, my question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer update the House on measures the government is taking to improve housing affordability, including in my electorate of Bennelong? Is the Treasurer aware of any higher taxing alternative ideas?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for Bennelong for his question. And I remind the House, a victor over Senator Keneally in straight sets, Mr Speaker. And the member for Bennelong knows that Labor's plan to get rid of negative gearing is turning into a big negative for them and anyone who would elect a Labor government, Mr Speaker. And the benefit of having a strong, growing economy is that we create more jobs, there's more money in people's pockets and they have a better chance of getting into the housing market. And over the last financial year, more than 115,000 first-home buyers got approval for a loan, Mr Speaker, the highest number since 2009. That's right. And it's a result of the policies that we are putting in place. APRA, the prudential regulator, has tightened the lending for investors, Mr Speaker. We have put in place our first home buyer super saver scheme, Mr Speaker. We've made it easier for seniors to downsize their property, Mr Speaker, and to put the proceeds of sale into their superannuation, Mr Speaker. And we have tightened the rules around foreign investors in the residential home market, Mr Speaker. Now, this is what is helping to change the dynamic in the housing market from one which is led from investor-led growth to one which is owner-occupier-led growth, Mr Speaker. Now, this is also leading to an orderly unwind in the housing sector, Mr Speaker. And for 12 consecutive months, housing prices have come down in the capital cities. But this orderly unwind and this stability in the housing sector is at risk from Labor's new property tax grab, Mr Speaker. A new tax grab with their changes to negative gearing and capital gains, Mr Speaker. Now, Standard & Poor's have said that if house prices were to fall sharply in Australia, this would increase risks to Australia's AAA credit rating, Mr Speaker, and increase the risk to Australia's economic growth and to financial stability, Mr Speaker. Riskwise has said that Labor's policies could put downward pressure by up to 9% on the family home, Mr Speaker. Citigroup has said that Labor's policy would accentuate the cyclical weaknesses, Mr Speaker. CoreLogic has said that Labor's policy will have a negative impact on buyer confidence, Mr Speaker. And we know that 58,000 teachers, 41,000 nurses, 19,000 police and emergency services with negative geared properties would all be worse off as a result of Labor's policy, Mr Speaker. No wonder the member for Lilly said it was economically disastrous to change negative gearing. Only the coalition can be trusted to protect the value in your family home.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Is the Prime Minister aware of a newspaper article written by Sherry Marks and headed, and I quote, "ScoMo dumps Mal as envoy," and, I quote, "Furious PM to stop Mal's duties on the international stage," which reports the Prime Minister is, and I quote, "done with Malcolm Turnbull and won't ask him to represent Australia in the wake of his failure to help in Wentworth." Given that only this morning the Prime Minister said Malcolm Turnbull would represent the nation extremely well, is that report correct? Is the Prime Minister really ruling out—
The member's time has concluded. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It's not.
The member for Robertson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and my question is to the Minister for Energy. Will the minister update the House on why the government's focus on reducing power prices is so important for small businesses and households, including in my electorate of Robertson, and what are the risks for families and small businesses from different approaches?
The Minister for Energy.
Well, I thank the member for her question, and I acknowledge the hard work she does for the families and small businesses of Robertson. Now, I was very pleased to visit her electorate just a couple of weeks ago up on the Central Coast, and we visited a business there called Simply Smashing, a car repair shop in West Gosford. Now, Simply Smashing is literally being smashed by higher electricity prices. They made the point that higher electricity prices doubled
Members
under
on
the
my
previous
left.
Labor government. The cost of energy is holding
The Minister will pause for a second. Members on my left will cease interjecting. The member for Lyons, who's in conversation with the member for Solomon, which is good at one level because he's not interjecting, is warned. The Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The cost of energy is holding Simply Smashing back from employing more apprentices and paying their employees more. Now, Mr Speaker, families and small businesses up and down the Central Coast will benefit from our plan for more affordable, reliable energy announced by the Prime Minister and me yesterday. Our plan will lower power prices by stopping the price gouging from the big energy companies. We'll be bringing legislation forward. We will be bringing legislation forward to this parliament this year. Our plan will lower power prices by establishing a price safety net to be in place by the 1st of July with a down payment from the big energy companies from the 1st of January. We're backing investment in fair dinkum reliable generation with a short list of projects by early next year. And from July 1, we'll require energy companies to invest in that fair dinkum electricity generation years ahead to meet customers' needs. Now, Mr Speaker, the rip-offs have to stop. The AMC has found that customers on standing offers could be paying up to $832 more than available market offers to those households. But it gets worse, because small businesses, Mr Speaker,
Member for
paying
Wakefield,
up to $3,500 more in higher electricity prices than alternative offers in the market. And what this shows is just how outrageous those standing offers are. Now, the member asked about risks posed by alternative approaches, and we know what the alternative is, Mr Speaker. The alternative is a big new carbon tax. Labor's targets are way higher than they were last time, and their carbon tax will be way higher than it was last time. Their tax will drive up prices just like they have in Labor's experiment in South Australia, as we saw in Blackwood just last week. We are on the side of Australian households.
The member for Barton.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. I refer to the reports the Prime Minister has dumped Malcolm Turnbull as his envoy because he didn't help the government. Can the Prime Minister please explain to the House how Malcolm Turnbull has been unhelpful to the government, but the government's other envoys, the member for New England and the member for Warringah, have been good for government unity?
Members on my left, the Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, the reports are false, and I would encourage the opposition to spend a bit more time focusing on questions about the economy, about drought, about electricity prices, and get their heads out of the Canberra bubble.
The member for Goldstein.
My question is to the Minister for Senior Australians and Aged Care. Will the minister update the House on how the government is helping retirees and pensioners to earn more and live better? Is the minister aware of any different ideas that would raise taxes and hurt self-reliant senior Australians?
The Minister for Senior Australians and Aged Care.
Mr Speaker, I thank you. And I also thank the member for Goldstein for his ongoing interest in us senior Australians as a young man. It's great. We are focusing on senior Australians because one of our key strategies is ageing well. And in that key strategy, we're looking at the fitness and sporting initiatives that will encourage senior Australians to become active. Equally, social connectedness is important. But there are 2 points in life in which we are going to have senior Australians stop for a moment, think about their life on their journey to 100 and undertake 2 checks. In both intervals, they will have a health check. They will have a look at a career check in case they wish to change their minds and look at some options. But the other one that's important is a financial check, because that financial check will enable them to see if they have sufficient funding for their retirement years and their aged care. And on that basis, what we will see is that they will make some judgments about the security of their future. But that future is only secure if there's no risk. And let me say that Labor's franking policy, the credits policy, is a risk. It will detract from their capacity to pay for the little things that are important to them, the paint job. So those thousands of dollars that are important to their life and to their cost of living will be impacted on. And we'll see that 84% of those people have a salary of less than $37,000 annually, and that's going to hit them quite hard when you think of the thousands of dollars that will be taken away by your tax. In addition, 900,000 Australians, including retirees and other low-income earners, receive dividends, and those dividends mean everything to them. And I hear some interjections, but if we are serious about caring for older Australians, then we won't hit them with that level of funding.
They've earned it. It's their money.
A vote for Australia's Labor policy will see them lose significantly. And what's important is that you don't take their money, that you don't dip your hands in their pockets and take what they've worked for over a period of time, making a contribution to their life and to their planning. That's why those 2 intervals of 45 and 65 give them the opportunity to financially plan for a future that gives them security and the opportunity to make use of their money for their holidays, for their way of life, and for the little things that are important to them and their grandchildren and their children. So I want all of them to think about Labor's policy, what that means for them, and the impact that voting for Labor will have on their lifestyle. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you. My question is to the Prime Minister. When the now Prime Minister was Treasurer, he cut over $83 million from the ABC. Last night at Senate estimates, the acting Managing Director of the ABC said, and I quote, "Those sort of budget reductions aren't achieved without major disruption." Will the Prime Minister now reverse his cuts so the ABC won't be forced to cut services, including the vital service it provides to Australians who live in rural and regional Australia?
Members on my right. The member for Wright. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Leader of the Opposition may not be aware, but for many, many years, like all other government agencies who were subject to an efficiency dividend, the ABC never was. They were never subject to that efficiency dividend. And what we've basically done is that the future growth profile in their spending has been adjusted. It still goes up every year, Mr Speaker. $1 billion a year is spent on the ABC, and our government simply formed the view that if it's okay for every other government agency and government service delivery in the country to be living within its means, then frankly it's okay for the ABC too. But a few minutes ago I challenged the Leader of the Opposition to get his head out of the Canberra bubble and start asking me questions about jobs and the economy and about drought. And what does he ask me about? He asked me about the ABC budget, Mr Speaker. That's what he asked me about. Well, the ABC budget is going up, Mr Speaker. It's going up each and every year, and we're asking the ABC to make sure that they do things efficiently like all other parts of the government does, right across the board. Right across the board, Mr Speaker. If the Labor Party thinks that the ABC should get a special deal on funding as opposed to all the other agencies of government, well, they can make that case. But we believe the ABC should be run efficiently, it should be run independently, and it should do a great job for taxpayers. And I believe it does do a great job, Mr Speaker, but they have to live within their means like every other part of government.
The member for Boothby.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Jobs, Industrial Relations and Women. Will the Minister update the House on how the government is helping to support the prosperity of small businesses and employees? What are the risks associated with different approaches?
The Minister for Jobs, Industrial Relations and Women.
I thank the hard-working member for Boothby for her question. Our government stands for greater prosperity for all Australians. We don't subscribe to the divisive and harmful rhetoric that is spoken about by the member for Lilly, where he says that we should have a class war, that we should divide Australians, we should pit them one against the other. We stand for successful Australians, for those Australians who want to be successful, and we're interested in backing them and making sure that those Australians who want to have a go can in fact have a go. We want to put more money back into their pockets, and we're doing that by bringing forward tax cuts for all Australians to make sure that 98% of those who have small businesses in this country have a tax cut. Because we know that when small business has a tax cut, they can invest more in their business, and when they invest more in their business, they can grow the job opportunities for their businesses, and that they can bring forward higher wages for those people who work for their small businesses. We also want to make sure that we protect the superannuation savings of those people who work hard in this country. We are putting forward with our bills in the Senate protections for those people who would otherwise be ripped off by the changes made by the Leader of the Opposition, the rorts and rip-offs for those people who have low balance accounts. But I'm sad to say that those opposite have a very different approach when it comes to ensuring the prosperity of all Australians, because they are hopelessly under the thumb of militant unions in this country. We have already seen it with their approach to the TPP, where they would shut down the opportunity for those people who want to export to countries overseas, our farmers, our manufacturers, our service providers. But that, of course, is just the start. At their party conference in December, those opposite will quietly sign up to industrial relations policies straight from the last century. In fact, it won't surprise me if the Leader of the Opposition strides onto stage with flares and platform shoes, because he is going to take the industrial relations policy of the Labor Party back to the 1970s. It is going to be a return to the dark days of mass walkouts, citywide shutdowns. We all got a little taste of it yesterday, courtesy of the ACTU, where we're going to see a return to the shutdown of our cities with widespread blockades, with picket lines, which will, of course, cause damage to small business, to the people who work for them, and to the prosperity of the millions of Australians who rely on them.
The Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Environment Minister. Does the minister rule out approving new nuclear power plants?
The Minister for the Environment has the call. Members on my left, the Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member opposite for his question. There is no change to government policy.
The member for O'Connor.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Will the minister update the House on the importance of a strong, consistent and well-developed border protection policies? Is the minister aware of any alternative approaches that would threaten Australia's border integrity?
The Minister for Home Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Everybody knows in this country that the government needs to keep control of its borders, and people know that when Mr Howard left office in 2007, there were 4 people in detention, including no children. And, Mr Speaker, we know that when Labor took office, they brought 50,000 people in on 800 boats, 1,200 people drowned at sea, and 8,000 children, Mr Speaker, went into detention, and it was a disgrace. Now, Mr Speaker, we have spent every day since then cleaning up Labor's mess. We have got all of the children out of detention and closed 17 detention centres in Australia. We are working to get the people off Manus and Nauru that Labor put there. We have an arrangement, Mr Speaker, with the United States where now 439 people have left Manus and Nauru to go to the United States. We've reduced down to around about 52 children on Nauru. People are living in the community, and we are getting them off methodically, as we have done, Mr Speaker. Now, I hear an interjection saying, "Bring them here." Bring them here, Labor says. Bring them here. Well, Mr Speaker, let me say this. If you want to see children in detention,
member for MacArthur.
Vote for Labor. If you want to see deaths at sea again, vote for Labor. If you want to see those 17 detention centres, Mr Speaker, reopen, vote for Labor, because the fact is that Labor, when they were in government under Mr Rudd and Ms Gillard, are making exactly the same mistakes as we are seeing now by this Leader of the Opposition. Imagine our surprise when we received a letter this week from the Shadow Minister for Immigration and Border Protection. No one knows who he is, but he sits on this front bench. Imagine our surprise when he announced by way of letter on email late one night, almost 10 o'clock earlier this week, that Labor had again changed its policy on border protection. It was the second proposal around legislation in 2 weeks, Mr Speaker, and now we know from a report in the Sydney Morning Herald, Mr Speaker, that it wasn't anything about good policy, it wasn't anything virtuous, it was an attempt, Mr Speaker, to head off a messy discussion in Labor's caucus on Tuesday. That's what it was about, Mr Speaker. It was about politics, and as we know, there is division within the Labor Party on border protection, like we saw in the Rudd and Gillard years. Mr Speaker, we are cleaning up Labor's mess. We are not going to allow those boats to restart. We are not going to allow the US deal to be undermined. We are not having people come to our country who would pose national security risks to our country. We will do what is in the best interest of this country. We are not going to take advice from those opposite who continue to preside over dysfunction in relation to border protection policy.
The Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Environment Minister, and I refer to her previous answer. What is the government policy on new nuclear power plants?
The Minister for the Environment.
You have to change the law to build them.
The Minister has the call. Members on both sides will cease interjecting.
Thank you. Currently, the legislation does not allow such nuclear plant development.
The member for Latrobe.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is for the Minister for Immigration, Citizenship and Multicultural Affairs. Will the Minister update the House on the status of people subject to the regional processing arrangements in Nauru? How is the government managing this issue?
The Minister for Immigration.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. And in addressing this issue, it's important to put the matter into some context. Now, Australia has one of the most substantial refugee and humanitarian programs in the world. This program year, we will welcome 18,750 people to Australia on humanitarian visas. Per capita, we're one of the most generous nations in the world. In fact, of major developed nations, only Canada is comparable. Secure borders are fundamental to an orderly humanitarian program. Without secure borders, we lose the capacity to make choices about the composition and nature of our humanitarian program. Now, I remind the House, Mr Speaker, that in relation to Nauru, there are 65 medical professionals contracted by the Australian government there, including 33 mental health professionals. I would also like to amend an answer I gave yesterday in relation to the total number of transferees on Nauru. The correct figure is 608, somewhat less than the figure of 635, which was provided to me yesterday. Now, Mr Speaker, in relation to those transferees on Nauru have the same ability to move around the island as the other 10,000+ residents of Nauru. They are not in detention. In addition, numerous refugees in Nauru are employed in a variety of occupations, and a number have started businesses there. Now, Mr Speaker, this government will never allow Australia's immigration policies to go back to the humanitarian catastrophe that was wrought by those opposite when they were in office. 50,000 people arrived. Tragically, 1,200 people died at sea, including children. We will never know how many children perished, but we do know that we must never, ever allow the evil trade of people smugglers to start again. Now, we know that Labor forcibly placed 8,000 children into detention during its time in government. In June of 2010, they opened the Curtin Immigration Detention Centre in WA. Now, by July of 2013, the flow of boats was such that 1,687 people were detained at that centre that Labor opened. In June of that year, 114 children were confined behind its fences. And it wasn't just there, Mr Speaker. In December of 2011, the Labor government opened the Wickham Point Immigration Detention Centre. By May of 2013, 1,988 people were confined in that centre. In August of 2013, Mr Speaker, and this is a very important point, in the dying days of the Labor government at Wickham Point Detention Centre, there were some 409 children confined in that centre. They opened Christmas Island Detention Centre. We closed it. We stopped the boats, we got the children out of detention, and we closed the overflowing immigration detention centres. And we did all this, Mr Speaker, while running a generous humanitarian program matched by very few countries in the world. We will never go back to the Labor Party's approach to this area.
The member for Port Adelaide.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Environment Minister. On Sky News this morning, the minister confirmed that she had now looked at the IPCC report closely. As the minister is aware, the greatest threat facing the Great Barrier Reef is the impact of climate change. What is the IPCC report's conclusion regarding the likely impact of 1.5 and 2 degrees of warming on the Great Barrier Reef?
Members on my right. The Leader of the House and the Treasurer. The Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. Mr Speaker, the government respects the credibility of the International Panel on Climate Change, and as we have said in the past, that we will consider this report and other relevant information on climate change in our decision-making. The IPCC makes no recommendation to government. What it does is that it gives the view on a variety of things with respect to the environment, including reefs around the world, not just the Great Barrier Reef. Exactly. It presents a series of model pathways to limit global warming. And I might point out, Mr Speaker, that those model pathways include a range of technologies in the energy mix beyond 2050. And just as Dr Alan Finkel has said, Australia's chief scientist, the debate should not be about technology when we're talking about emissions and with respect to climate change. Mr Speaker, we on this side are very determined to protect the health of the reef. We are the ones who have invested significantly in the reef. Unlike those opposite who had them on the watch list, we've got it off the watch list. We are particularly committed to those 64,000 people who rely upon
Member for Parramatta
with respect to the reef and those billions of dollars that the reef contribute to our economy. Now, I should think that the member for Herbert, I think the people in her electorate would care about what we are doing for the reef. You would think that. What about the member for Dawson? Does the people in his electorate, do they care about how we are investing in the reef? I think so. Member for Leichhardt, he cares very deeply about what we are doing about the health of the reef. We will continue to review the IPCC report. The people of regional Queensland know they can trust us. They can't trust that lot.
The member for Tangney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. Will the Minister update the House on how a stronger economy enables investment in new, life-changing medicines and improves the affordability of private health insurance? What would be the outcome for those relying on the supply of those medicines recommended by experts if different approaches were pursued?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Tangney, who is a great advocate for new medicines being listed on the PBS, and I was honoured to join him recently in his electorate at Fiona Stanley Hospital, where we announced support for Symphony, a medicine to assist those with the agonising condition of spinal arthritis. But more than that, he knows that you can only continue to list medicines if there's a strong economy, if the budget is able to pay for it, if we aren't facing a crisis. And in particular, I am delighted to be able to inform the House that we have announced today that $80 million will be invested in the listing of 2 new medicines for chronic eye conditions. In particular, we are supporting 4,500 Australians with eye conditions for blocked veins in the retina and also for macular degeneration. And these medicines, Ozurdex and Lucentis, would otherwise have cost, in one case $5,000 and in one case $7,000 a year, and been beyond the reach of many elderly patients, of many patients with lower incomes. And so this is literally giving the gift of better sight and potentially of saving sight to patients because of those investments. But I also know that we have maintained that throughout our time in government. And one of the claims made yesterday by the member for Ballarat was that we had in some way deferred the listing of a whooping cough medicine. Now, I thought that doesn't seem right, but I'm going to go and check the facts because I'm not going to take what the member for Ballarat said on face value. And you know what? I was right to check the facts, because what the member for Ballarat said was that the PBAC recommended that the whooping cough vaccine for pregnant women be listed in July 2016. No, it didn't. It said that provisionally there had to then go and be a critical study by the Australian Technical Advisory Group on
members on my right.
Some of the most respected medical professionals in the country. And you know what? They did that with their consideration in February and October of 2017, provided their final advice to the PBAC, and the PBAC made their recommendation in February of 2018, and we announced our listing in May of 2018, and we delivered it on the 1st of July of 2018. The member for Ballarat misled the House. Now, I'm not saying it was deliberate. I am saying it was incompetent.
The Minister will just resume his seat for a second. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Speaker, the minister is making a claim that should be made only by direct motion.
Members on my right, I don't need your assistance. This point came up, an identical point came up from the other side by the Leader of the House, and I've made it very clear, unless the term deliberately mislead is used, that doesn't apply. The Minister is in order. The Minister has the call for 10 seconds.
The member for Ballarat may want to approach the box and apologise for misleading the House.
The member for Ballarat has the call.
Thank you very much. And my question is to the Minister
Treasurer.
for Health. Is the Minister aware that his own department—
The member for Ballarat will just pause. The Treasurer and others will cease interjecting. I'm going to allow the questioner to ask the question in a manner that I can hear it. The member for Ballarat has the call.
Thank you. Is the Minister aware that his own department provided a list yesterday of 83 medicines that have been recommended by the independent experts but not listed on the PBS? Is the Minister aware that the list includes medicines that were recommended as far back as 2016? How can the Minister stand by his previous answer on PBS listings when he has delayed access to some life-saving drugs for more than 2 years?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And let me make this absolutely clear. I did a little bit more research on their claims yesterday. And I saw the list that the member for Ballarat put out. I think it was in August, of 8 medicines that she claimed had been deferred. None of them had been deferred by government policy. And you know what? I looked at 2 things. I looked at major new listings that we've done recently, and then I looked at what they did. Major new listings that we did recently in terms of breast cancer, Kisqali, SMA, Spinraza, cystic fibrosis, Kalydeco, cystic fibrosis or Cambi, all done within 3.5 months.
The Minister for Health will just pause. The Minister for Health will pause. If the member for Ballarat's rising on a point of order on direct relevance, the Minister is only about 30 or 40 seconds into his answer. I'm listening carefully. She can raise the point of order now. It doesn't bother me, but that'll be it. Okay. The Minister for Health. The Minister for Health has the call.
Well, that was effective. And in terms of the list last published by the member for Ballarat, very interestingly, she claims that a hepatitis C medicine was deferred. We did a little bit of research and we discovered that the company, even though they wanted the listing, didn't have the medicines available and requested that the government delay until they had the medicines, so as once it was announced they could supply immediately. That medicine is Maverick, hepatitis C, the company is AbbVie, and the advice was provided by the company. But the total period for the medicine she talked about was an average of 8 months to listing, and then I compared that with Labor's deferred medicines, the 7 medicines that they deliberately delayed by policy, an average of 14.1.
The Minister will resume his seat. A member for Ballarat on a point of order.
Thank you, Speaker. On direct relevance, I was asking about the information provided by the Minister's own department overnight that shows that you have not listed 83 medicines, some from back as far as 2016.
Member for Ballarat will resume her seat. I've just got to call the Minister, then he can go. The Minister has the call.
Our policy is absolutely clear. We will list every medicine that the PBAC recommends. Their policy was absolutely clear, that they would defer the listing of medicines until such time as fiscal circumstances permitted. And I also did a little bit more research as to the Senate committee. And what did the Senate committee say about their policy at the time? Quote, "It constitutes a major, unnecessary and unwelcome change in government policy." What did the Consumers Health Forum say? Consumers do not want a situation in which drugs are listed on the PBS to win votes or boost opinion polls. And that was what they said about the Labor government and the Labor policy at the time. What did Sane Australia say about the Labor government and the Labor policy at the time? The decision to defer the recommendation of the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee to list medication jeopardises the integrity of the PBS process. So now is the time for the member for Ballarat to apologise for incompetently misleading the House yesterday in relation to hepatitis C, in relation in particular to whooping cough. Caught out, caught red-handed, and time to apologise.
The member for Ballarat seeking to table the document.
Thank you. I'm seeking leave to table the notice that we received from your own department of the 83 medicines that you have delayed.
Yes, I'll take that. Leave is not granted. Leave is not granted. The member for Grey has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Families and Social Services. And will the minister update the House on how the government is supporting families in my electorate of Grey with the cashless debit card, including getting people off welfare and into work? And is the minister aware of any alternative approaches that would not help families in this way?
The Minister for Families and Social Services.
Well, I do thank the member for Grey, who's been a very strong advocate for a fair and sustainable welfare system, including championing the selection of Ceduna in his electorate as a location for the first trial of the cashless debit card, the arrangement under which 80% of your welfare benefit is paid onto the card, and you can't use it to buy drugs, to buy alcohol, to purchase gambling products, but you can use it to buy the necessities of life. And, Mr Speaker, the results from the assessment of the trial in the first two trial sites, including Ceduna, vindicate the member's confidence, because 41% of participants who drank alcohol report drinking less. 48% of participants who used drugs reported using fewer drugs. What did the Mayor of Ceduna, Mr Alan Souter, say? He said, quotes, "We think the cashless debit card is probably the best thing that has ever happened for our community." Close quotes. What did the Chief Executive of the Ceduna Aboriginal Corporation, Mick Haynes, have to say? He said, "We have turned a corner. The card is working." Now, where is Labor, Mr Speaker, on this issue? Because when the member for Jagga was the minister, she consistently supported income management and expanded the arrangements across a number of regions. With the cashless debit card, the next generation of income management, what is Labor doing? Labor is opposing it, Mr Speaker. Quite extraordinary. Labor is more interested, it would seem, in the votes of the Green Left types munching on their quinoa and goat's cheese salads in their multi-million-dollar terrace houses than they are in a practical welfare reform which is helping remote communities function better, helping vulnerable Australians stabilise their lives, helping put food on the table for children in welfare households. Now, our approach, Mr Speaker, will get people off of welfare and into work. We've generated 1.1 million jobs since 2013, unemployment now at 5%. The best form of welfare, Mr Speaker, is a job. Labor's approach, by contrast, is to impose economy-killing taxes. It's to stifle investment and economic growth. It's to drive up unemployment. Labor's approach is to drive people out of work and onto welfare. That'll be the effect of Labor's policy. I say to the other side of the House, give up this lefty posturing. Do something that will actually help vulnerable Australians. Support the cashless debit card.
The member for Port Adelaide.
You're badly advised.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Environment Minister. I refer to reports the minister told the former president of Kiribati, and I quote, "I know why you're here, it's for the cash. For the Pacific it's always about the cash. I have my chequebook here, how much do you want?" On Wednesday in question time, the minister 100% denied making that statement, but on Thursday she couldn't recall the complete conversation but apologised anyway. And yesterday the minister was again in denial. How can the minister not remember what she said and at the same time be 100% confident she didn't say it?
The member's time has concluded. The Minister for the Environment has the call.
Already dealt with that issue. Already dealt with that issue.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and thank you for the question. We have got so much to talk about in this place, and we have achieved an awful lot on this side for the economy and also for the environment. The way that the conversation was reported by Patrick Dodson was incorrect. I've said that in the past because of the words, Mr Speaker, because of the words that were used. Thank you.
The member for Flynn.
My question is to the Minister of Agriculture and Water Resources. Will the minister explain why the government believes in supporting our farmers? What is the government doing to act on that belief by providing support, assistance, market opportunities and food and fibre producers?
The Minister for Agriculture has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the honourable member for his question, because he understands the importance of agriculture and the challenges that we're facing currently with drought. And it's important to understand that while there has been some good rain in the eastern parts of the country, some parts have missed out. So it's important that this government continues on this journey of ensuring we support our primary producers, and on Friday we'll bring together the stakeholders to ensure that we have a policy fit for future. We've put over $1.8 billion on the table already, but it's important that we coordinate that with state agencies who have the responsibility of looking after animal welfare. It's actually the federal government's responsibility to look after the farmer welfare. And we've done that, and we're making sure we continue to do that not only for farmers but for those small regional communities that support them. We've increased the amount to farm household assistance to $37,626. It's important to understand that doesn't just go to household expenses. That goes into the shops, into the butcher and the baker, into those small towns to keep them employed. We've put more rural financial counsellors on the ground, an extra 39 to complement the 116 that are already there. They're real jobs in regional communities, putting dollars back through those communities as well. But we've invested a further $1 million into each drought shire to ensure that councils can invest in projects that will use local businesses, procure local resources to keep those local economies going, because it's not just farmers that hurt in this, it's small businesses that hurt in this. And it's important we understand that unless we have a policy that goes right through the economy within these local small communities, they all suffer. So it's important that we continue on that journey. We invest for the future, and we're investing in the future in water infrastructure. $2.5 billion has been put on the table. $500 million of that has nearly been spent to build 8 nation-building projects to not only build resilience and preparedness for drought, but to build greater productivity and profitability for our farming sector. It's important that we have these nation-building projects to ensure agriculture goes to the next level, to take advantage of the trade agreements that we put in place, the $313 million that we invested in this year's budget to protect our biosecurity, to keep our clean green image, to make sure that our farmers get the returns that they deserve. But the biggest investment that this government has made since the drought has been declared is additional money in our farmers' mental welfare. We've invested a further $11.4 million in programs to be run on the ground, to sit around farmers' kitchen tables to help them through. We've made sure that the Medicare rebate's been extended for them to be able to sit in their home, in the sanctity of their own home, and ask for help. And I say and I plead to every primary producer, to every person that's in regional rural Australia or any Australian, you should never feel ashamed to ask for help. We live in a great country, and you should always be prepared to ask that help. And I say to each and every one of us to reach out to someone we know and ask, "Are you okay?"
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice.
I thank the Prime Minister.